There's one more thing I must do. Slinky.
Everyone
There's
loves a
your cold
slinky.
open right there.
Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore, and I am one of your hosts. I'm here joined by the same lovely face I am every week, Mr. Scott Melson.
Hey, guys.
Also in the studio, in the upper room with us today, is a return guest, John Rourke.
The upper room.
The upper room, indeed. You weren't here last week when we so christened this space.
Yeah.
Oh, I was
Also, I
not.
was going to say, if you were interested in soundproofing, not that you should, but I found on Amazon they're like $1 a piece for 12 by 12 squares.
Yes.
It's like a 12 pack. There's even one for $9.99 of different kinds.
Oh,
So,
all right.
Anyway, so today I wanted to start by catching up where we left off when John was last with us, and that was well, for one, it was Veterans Day, and today we're recording this on Thursday the 7th, which happens to be Pearl Harbor Day. That is,
Apropos.
you were not in Pearl Harbor, but you are a veteran, and we thank you for that again. But at the end of our last episode with you, we all placed our guess,
Small wager.
our wager. There was no money involved, but our own predictions, we'll say that, for what would happen with the outcome of the special session and the governor's veto. And we went over that already on a previous episode of the pod, but separately, apart from our discussion on the recording, the three of us had a group text in which Scott said, "What do we get John if he's right and the governor vetoes this?" And I said, "Let's fix this tote bag,"
Tote, that's right.
which I
at the
have for
time
you today.
Oh.
Did not exist. But now exists.
Well, thank you. I've just been given a lovely tote.
I was ordering some for myself, and so I have something to tote my "Let's fix this" gear around. So
Well, this is great. I really appreciate it. I'm sad to have been the dissenting voice of this group.
someone had to add some drama.
Well, you know. And in the end, I think it was, honestly, it was probably a good decision because I was much more fond of option A than option B
Sure.
on the budget. So,
Right.
Sure.
you know, I guess we'll keep this as a running theme when the three of us are together and taking small bets on what the legislature will do in the great state of Oklahoma.
Let's go ahead and get that out of the way then.
Sure.
So then we know there's going to be another special session, a second extraordinary session. Regardless of when the governor calls it, when do you think it will actually, that she'll say this is the first day?
That's a
So
great
what's-
question. Just point of clarification. When you have a special session and that special session ends and you need to call an extra, is that still called a special session? Or is it no longer special
If there's more than one,
if there's more than one?
No, it's still special.
it's just special in a different kind of way.
Well, now if we're getting really technical, it's not special. It's extraordinary. So I think constitutionally it's mandated that the governor may call extraordinary sessions, as many as she wants, and she can actually call it concurrently with regular session.
Right. And the difference being there's an ordinary session and then
Right.
an extraordinary or extraordinary, if you depending on your pronunciation, which
Indeed.
emphasis on the different syllables.
Nice.
All right, so today, this episode is going to be, I think, the first of maybe a series.
Yeah.
Scott and I have discussed doing a series about the topic of community. I don't know, did I say this to you when I invited you on?
You did.
Okay. So I shared this the other day on Twitter and Facebook that I listened to an episode of On Being with Krista Tippett. It's a radio program and podcast that NPR supports, and you can get there. You can get it. I forget the website, but just Google On Being with Krista Tippett. Many of you, I'm sure, know who she is.
Great podcast,
Just
great.
fantastic
Phenomenal.
series. Fantastic. Side note: Krista Tippett from the great state of Oklahoma,
She is an Oklahoman. That's right. She references it in this episode that was just the other day.
born and raised in Shawnee, America.
Really?
Yeah,
Pod County, huh? Mm-hmm.
High school?
So,
I believe so. Yeah.
are you asking which one?
Or did
Oh,
she?
yeah,
Did she
I was
attend high school
asking
here?
if it was actually in Shawnee.
Yeah, I think so.
That she attended high school in Shawnee.
Oh, I
don't
believe
know.
so. I believe
Is there
so.
more than one high school in Shawnee?
At the
don't.
time she was here, I think there was just one. There
Okay.
may be two now, but maybe just one.
She would have graduated in like 77, 78, somewhere in there, I think.
Yeah.
CD5.
There you go. That's right. So we wanted to maybe talk about community. So the most recent episode of On Being was about community, and they interviewed a couple of different folks, and the conversation about community they referenced politics a little bit, and it made me think that politics has a way, it could be, I think, to create a sense of community and to bring people together. It can certainly also be a thing that divides us. And
Sure.
maybe we see that a lot right now in America and even here in Oklahoma. And that it occurs to me that surely there's something we can do about that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it kind of, I think that we're operating right now in a paradigm where politics is seen as a contest, and I don't just mean that electorally, but I think that politics right now, we are in a season where politics it's war, right? It's us against them, and whoever is not,
Dichotomous.
whoever's not in my tribe is in the opposing tribe, and they're the enemy. And the goal isn't good policy; the goal is to beat them, right? Like it is a competition fundamentally, as opposed to, I think, the idea of politics as a community. We could get back to kind of what the root of it should be, which is about moving forward, finding consensus, finding compromise, right? I think there's a time period where politics was looked at as it's messy, it can be dirty, but politics is the art of bringing disparate groups together, forging a consensus opinion that everyone can live with and that hopefully is good for society, and moving forward. But that's not where we are right now.
Well, and that's an interesting perspective, and I hope that you are right. And I think that's maybe the jumping off point here is that I don't know that everyone agrees with that right now. And so as I was thinking about this, there was a quote in the episode of On Being. So it's a quote from James Baldwin, kind of social critic and someone involved in the civil rights movement, where he says, "I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain."
Yeah.
Which, and we were just discussing Star Wars before we started recording. It sounds a lot like Yoda, right? Where fear is the path to the dark side, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. So this kind of undercurrent that there's a lot of hurting out there, and that maybe we cling to, it's easier to hate someone that we think causes us hate than to actually, or to cause us pain, than it is to deal with whatever pain there is. It's easy just to split somebody off. Do you guys think that's true at all?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think not only is it easier to do that, but I also think that we have leaders who recognize that about the human psyche and prey on it. Whatever you think about President Trump, whether you agree with his policies, disagree, whatever, I think that one of the reasons that he was elected was that he was able to go into communities in this country that are feeling an intense amount of pain and suffering, lost jobs, wage stagnation, opioid addiction, towns are shrinking, kids leave, they don't come back, if they can leave at all. And I think that President Trump was able to go in those communities and say, one, I have a plan to make your lives better, but two, I know whose fault it is that you're suffering in the first place.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
So, yeah, I'm going to concur with that and say that what you have is a fostering of a sense of anti-establishment, right? So that there is some seen or unseen force that is responsible for your suffering, and that there is a contingent of folks, politicians that are willing to capitalize on that sentiment and say, I alone, or I and my coalition have the answer for taking up against the establishment that is causing you that suffering. So,
yeah, in future weeks, as we kind of move along with this series, we're going to visit with some members of the clergy from maybe, hopefully, some different religions even, because certainly this is not just a Christian issue, although that is the predominant religion in America, and certainly probably the one that most of our listeners and most citizens identify with. And that's maybe the faith background that I think the three of us all grew up with, and so seeing things through that lens, the issue of theodicy, that there is there's pain and suffering in the world. How do we reconcile that with the idea that someone should be good, and that there should be some kind of a path forward, a sense of hope or a future, and I think in many ways it feels like we've kind of lost that right now.
Yeah, and I think kind of going like back to thinking about the episode of On Being, I think that you're right that politics absolutely can be an avenue for community. It's not the only, right? Like there's certainly a lot of different ways to build community, and we need to build community in different ways. I personally think that if you look at us as human beings, I think that one of the reasons that this, certainly listening to these words about, community and relationships, it resonates so much with me because my belief is that as people, this is kind of how we're built, right? This is how we're put together. We're, whether you're looking at it from a theological perspective or a biological perspective, an evolutionary perspective, we're social animals, right? Like human beings are not meant to live in isolation. Wherever you think that comes from, it's just a fact that we're not. But not only do I think that politics can be an avenue for community, I think if politics is going to be successful, that community has to exist, right? They talk a lot about built like relationships, and that we like one of the authors that she talks to is that we as people, like as we're in society kind of trying to reconcile the times in which we find ourselves, we need to be better about seeing and hearing each other. And that really kind of struck me as we watch, Congress, as we watch the state legislature. It seems like so much of the time I see people just talking past each other, like
it's not, I think we expect that they're there listening to one another and weighing what the other people say. But if you watch it, either at the state capitol, you watch C-SPAN or whatever, that the chamber is largely empty, and that what I put a lot of importance on, like these passionate speeches that are well written and well thought out in many cases, that you would hope that they might sway votes, and I'm sure they do to a degree, but not as much as I think the common person probably thinks so.
Yeah, and I think when you conceive of politics as a representative notion, right, where individuals are trying to represent other people in the community, you think of it as a vehicle for being inclusive, for civil discourse, for finding common solutions. And what you have at this point is politics as othering, right? Mm-hmm. We're always looking at it. Well, it's not our fault, it's their fault. And and I think that's serving to drive that wedge instead of being a vehicle for what it should be, which is bringing people together to have a conversation about how we all move forward and the compromise that you were talking about just a while ago, Dr. Melson.
I agree. And so we've kind of, I think all of us agree, and I'm sure most of our listeners would as well, that at its core, politics is about people and relationships, or I would hope that it is. It's certainly about governing and maybe money to a degree, but I would argue that there is no aspect of the human condition that operates outside of relationships.
No,
everything, we are relational beings.
100%.
Scott said.
No, you'd really have to try
right.
Living outside of that. Right?
Even
you'd have to cloister.
Right. Even if you do, there's still a relationship with yourself, with the world around you. There's a transactional component to how we understand the world, right? I relate, I interact with things, whether it's coconuts on a deserted island or it's you nuts here in this upper room, like whatever it is. I think that one of the other ways that politics can help build community is that there is something powerful about showing up, like just physically being present, being there as not just as an elected official, but for us as voters to show up at the polls. That is how we deposit into those relationships, to show up in face-to-face conversations with our legislators, to show up in emails, handwritten letters, Christmas cards, as we're going to do in a few weeks, or next week, I guess. And that there's doing that. And also showing up in terms of like large groups of people, right? So rallies and those things have a place as well. And that demonstrates to others what we feel on the inside.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, thinking about, what this idea of kind of politics as community or community within politics. I wonder sometimes how much the advent of social media has changed the physical dynamics of relationships, both, certainly, I mean, relationships in general, but certainly in politics. One of the things that they spend some time talking about is this idea that, like, we need to practice our responses, that, there's neuropsychology research that is really showing that habits, things that we practice, things that we do daily, become ingrained to us at more than a psychological level. Like, they do become kind of part of who we are. And, with social media, we've developed this online culture where to say and do anything virtually is acceptable, right? Like, people say things on Twitter and Facebook that I have always thought, I mean, you would never say that in person.
Right.
But I think we're starting to see a change that, like, now some of that stuff is being said in person, right? Like, some of that stuff being, like, some of that stuff, like, those responses that used to be, oh, this only takes place online because that's kind of the safe space for that. Well, you do that enough, and pretty
normalized,
and pretty soon that's the response that you're going to have. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's the response that you're going to have even outside of that kind of protected domain.
Yeah, I think we certainly see examples of hate speech and actions and stuff that do start to occur in real life, and that is, it's not just frightening to me, it can be really discouraging.
Right. And, I think one thing as we're talking about this, it's important to remember, and I have to remind myself of this. It's easy to look at where we are in politics right now and think, like, oh my God, like, it's never been this bad. We've never seen anything like this before in our history. Politics I don't know that there's ever been a time where it's been a totally, like, clean, lighthearted, everybody disagrees, but they disagree. They disagree without being disagreeable. I don't know that that's, I think that there's a little bit of a myth to that, like the good old days. I mean, how the beginning of the Republic, right? So you've got Hamilton and his Federalists, and they're trying to, like, basically take over the government. Then Jefferson wins the presidency. Jefferson and Madison basically destroy the Federalist Party, and their party, I forget what they call it, what Jefferson's party was called, but
Southern Democratic
there you go.
Republicans.
Right, and they like run the country until the Civil War, and then the Civil War, Lincoln gets elected, and then Lincoln's Republican Party dominates the country. Like, they decimate the opposition, the Whigs, and then they run the country for the next 60 years. Like, even in the history of our republic, there has always been a lot of vitriol. That's my dog Juno in the background, friend of the pod.
She's dreaming?
She's dreaming. Yeah.
Oh, that's adorable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Normally Juno is downstairs or outside, but today she's joining us
Normally
upstairs.
passing through, but today she has
right.
decided to stay for the whole pod.
Yeah, she's stacked out.
Is this so that she doesn't get forced to listen to it later with just you?
Yes, right. So she'd have to sit on the couch with me while I drink whiskey and listen to the pod.
I just want to address one thing that you brought up, Scott. And here's a really great question. I think what we tend to talk about this time right now, when we're sitting around, upstairs on a pod, as like a uniquely divisive time in politics. And you reference sort of the ages gone by in American politics. And I really wonder, is it really more divisive now than it was 100 years ago?
Or
is
even
it
50?
More volatile now than it was 150 years ago? Or are we just seeing now in sort of, I think we're all of the same age group at this table, and is it just new for us? And we are sort of trying to navigate being a spectator in what is a more divisive time than was, say, 10, 15 years ago.
I think so. I mean, I think that for most of our adult life, for most of my adult life, it's been relatively peaceful. And certainly some things were occurring, below the surface, and it's different for our friends of color. Their experience is very different than ours. But one of my staff at my job is late 60s, close to 70. She's retired and then came back because she got bored at home. And so I've talked to her a lot lately. She's kind of always been politically active, less so now than when she was our age. And so the last several months I've talked to her and said, this is just so mind-boggling, so bizarre, and I'm not sure how to feel about it. And she kind of chuckles and says, we've been through this before. And I said, really? And I said, with Nixon? She's like, yeah. Like back when Nixon was president during the 60s and we had the civil rights movement and
Vietnam
and this stuff where, I mean, think about Vietnam as a soldier, as coming home and having people like actively do what would be
Spit at
considered
you, throw things.
yeah, like hate crimes at you.
lambast you if nothing else.
Right, and you're like, man, I got drafted. I didn't want to go, and so I can't imagine doing that to anyone, much less like a soldier who didn't want to go to war in the first place, but you didn't have a choice. You do what you got to do, and maybe there was some goodness in there. It's just that kind of thing sounds terrible. And the things that happened during the civil rights movement. A few months ago, I got to tour the Museum of African American Culture and History. John, did you get to go as well?
I did, yeah.
I don't know about you, but like the whole exhibit, especially it starts way back, like with the founding of the country, but the piece that I'm more aware of is, during the 60s and the lunch counters and all of that.
Sure. Which they have a mock-up of the lunch counters in there, and it's very powerful.
And I mean, I cried for like 3 hours, just kind of off and on. Going through, there's the part with the funeral thing and just the whole story and being like, I can't believe that this is not that long ago. But then you look outside, you read the news, like, well, okay, I can believe that this happened.
Yeah, and I mean, to go back even farther, I mean, we fought a war, right? I mean, there was a time where the divisiveness politically in this country was so bad that the country split up, and we fought a war.
That's true.
For 4 years, and hundreds of thousands of people died
about an issue that today sounds ridiculous. Right.
And so, I think you're 100% right. Like that, this is not divisiveness in politics is not a new thing. I think that it is, I don't know what the cycle is, but I think it is cyclical, right? Like it comes and goes, and I think that you're absolutely right that we're witnessing a particularly low point for the first time kind of in our lifetimes. I do wonder sometimes if there is something kind of unique about what we're seeing now. I mean, I do feel like that some of the stuff that I see on certainly national news, but even local news, that there are some kind of basic norms of decency that are being not just violated, but kind of just thrown by the wayside as if they don't matter. And it makes me wonder, like, is this going to do lasting and to a degree irreparable damage?
Right.
And I don't know the answer to that.
No, as I was kind of preparing for today, I ended up with more questions than answers, which is I'm okay with. I just realized how many questions that we probably all have. And so one of the things I thought about was, and this may be more unique to our time, is that there's, and they allude to this on the On Being episode, that there's a tendency in our society to break up rather than to endure difficult times, right? And so as a counselor who's helped, I don't know, close to, I think, 50 couples, last time I counted it up, like, cope with issues in their relationship. If they came to counseling, they generally were hoping to try to work through something, but there are uncounted numbers that don't, or that aren't able to. I mean, they try and they can't get through it. But I think so often in terms of politics, we see them, each side say, this is my perspective, these are my thoughts, here's where I'm at. The other side says, here's where I'm at. They disagree, and they decide, well, we just can't. Obviously, we disagree. Why even try? As opposed to maybe what you said earlier, Scott, that we would hope that the two sides would use that as a starting place and not an ending place, right? The disagreement isn't the fact that we end there. It's that maybe we start there and find how we get together, or find some kind of common ground.
No, I absolutely agree. And, this makes me what you mentioned. They talk about the tendency that we break, that we don't have commitment, right? Like that we break up rather than stay together. And this made me think of Ashley and I. We've been married for 10 years, so we had our 10-year anniversary in June.
Congratulations.
Thanks, man. And when we first got married, we moved to Oklahoma City, and we'd been married like a couple of months, and we were talking with friends, and we were talking with a couple that is about 10 years older than us, and they're still very, very dear friends, and we are just did what all newlyweds do, like, well, we've been married 2 months, you guys, any advice, like, what's the secret to your happy marriage? And you get tons of fairly cliched little tidbits from everyone that you talk to, but something that we were told that I think one really spoke to both of us, and we took to heart, and that we have come back to throughout our relationship, that I really think could benefit all relationships, especially kind of in the context of this conversation, is to always assume the best about each other.
Benefit of the doubt,
right?
That's a big thing.
To always assume, we don't approach conflict assuming that the other person has the worst of intentions, and I think that that's something that we see routinely in politics now, is the assumption that the other side is out to screw us in any way that they can, or they're out to do the worst possible thing, or they're gonna lie, or they're gonna cheat. Like, and I think this happens on, I'm not letting the blame at the feet of one party or the other, but I think we see that routinely, is that there's an assumption that the other side is disingenuous at best and malevolent at worst.
Well, and I mean, I think there's a natural impulse among all humans, is maybe a biological thing, to categorize an us versus them. I mean, it's a natural impulse to categorize and label, because it makes the world, which is very, very complex, easier to understand. And maybe that stems from early human experience, like interactions with nature and other tribes, to be like, these are safe. Don't eat those berries. Like whatever it is, that it helps at a. If you want to take kind of an evolutionary psychology look at things, it helps you understand what's safe and what's not, and so perhaps it's, in some ways, that's what people are doing, that they're trying to say, like, these people, this tribe they will keep me and my family safe in some ways. We're not right now. We're not fighting wars, but
so the exchange of information that leads to the common good is essentially what community is about. I mean, that's
right.
That's where we're getting, right?
Yeah.
And so the question becomes: so here we are, we're the very large, very diverse country, and we're in a situation where we have this sort of othering happening at the political level. How do we take the community approach to rectifying some of those issues on a political level at this point? How do we take it back to, like, don't eat those berries,
right?
Well, and even because it's good for all of us, not because I agree with you on a particular social issue. Right.
Well, I think you have to override it, though. Like, I think you have to. Like, I think that the monkey brain or the lizard brain or whatever brain you says like, okay, the impulse is don't eat those berries. The impulse is you're your tribe, I'm my tribe, you're whatever. But I think part of the reason we're successful as a species is that we have learned at times to override our monkey brain, and I think that's what we have to do now, right? Like, my impulse may be to say in conflict, like, no, Andy's lying, Andy's not, to assume because he's that tribe and I'm my tribe and we're different, and so the goal should be to beat him. But I think part of what has to happen is we have to practice and consciously, intentionally override that impulse and learn a different response.
So it's being proactive rather than being passive and letting it come to you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, not that, I was going to say, have we gotten lazy? Have we gotten exhausted is probably a better question, because it is more work to do that, right? It's easier just to have a knee-jerk, like, nope, they're bad. Like, oh, they're Republican, oh, they're Democrat, write them off, than it is to say, like, you know what, there's a nugget of truth. I don't agree with everything, but how do we shine light on the good parts and make the parts darker?
Right.
It's hard, you know? And so every person I talk to that says, "How do you keep doing what you do? Let's fix this." I'm like, oh.
It's also much easier to win elections giving in to the impulse, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, in our current climate, when you look at the way the primary system is set up, when you look at the way the districts are gerrymandered, when you look at how, like,
It's a tactic. It's no different than, say, a sports game, right? I mean, you're spreading the field out, right? I mean, you're using a proven tactic to win an election.
Sure, but I do think, though, that especially in a climate that we have, like the climate we have today, where we have tremendous inequality, right? We've seen I think a very definite class of people in America that have been victims rather than beneficiaries of things like globalization, technology, automation, right? You see factory towns in the Great Lakes region that have, shrunk and they're not coming back. I think that creates a lot of anxiety. And I think that as a short-term electoral strategy, it's really easy to go in there and say, you know what, it's this person's fault, or it's this group of people's fault, or it's this person. Like, it's easier to take that knee-jerk reaction and put the blame on the other tribe than it is to go in. It's easier to win elections doing that than it is to go in and try and have a very nuanced and complicated discussion about all the factors that have contributed to this situation and the complexity of solutions that it's going to take to make it better, right? Like Andy and I were talking last week, like one of my pet peeves is when I hear politicians say, oh, it's just a common sense solution. Like, we need common sense solutions. No, we don't need common sense solutions, right? How to combat what globalization has done to towns across the Great Lakes region, there's no common sense solution to that, right? Like that's complicated. But talking about complicated, I just think it's hard to win elections talking about complicated ideas.
Common sense too implies there's a connotation to that.
Right. Because what's common sense to me may not be to you, the complete opposite.
Right, and it's saying if you don't ascribe to my common sense solution, then you have no sense.
Right. I mean, to use a term that's being discussed a lot right now in national politics, trickle-down economics.
Yeah.
The idea of that is pretty palatable. Everyone's like, oh, right, okay, so they get money and then they spend it on work. It comes down, so we all win. That, unlike face value, it seems all right. It turns out it doesn't work maybe as advertised, not to the same degree that people hoped.
Right.
And so what seems common sense to me is to not do that anymore because clearly it hasn't worked for 30 years.
But an even more complicated argument would be to say that comments that trickle down or supply side, supply side economics maybe make sense in certain economic conditions. When you have incredibly high taxes and regulatory burdens that are decreasing output and production, maybe it makes sense to try and lessen that. But that economic argument may not apply in a much lower tax and lower regulatory environment. It's not as simple as, oh, this is always the solution, right? Just like government spending isn't always the solution to a recession, increasing taxes or decreasing taxes is not always the solution. Like, it's complicated.
Right. Yeah, it's all very complicated. And maybe as we're kind of getting close to wrapping up for today, and so maybe a place I'd like to end on goes back to that On Being podcast episode. The guy they interview, and I didn't pull up his name, I apologize, but he Anand. I'm not even.
You
didn't know it either. See?
No, I can. The thing is, I can see it in my head, but I also know I don't know how to pronounce it without looking at it again.
That's okay. So also, this goes back to the podcast, the On Being podcast that Krista asks one of the guests to give that starfish analogy, and we've all heard it before, and so I'll kind of share what he did. If I can find a way to cut it and paste it, I'll do it from here. But he talks about, the two people are walking along the beach and they see there's a bunch of starfish that are on the beach that are going to die if they don't get water. And so he's picking them up and tossing them back into the water. And the other person says, what difference does it make? And the guy
there's millions of starfish out here.
And the guy says, it matters to that one, as he kind of tosses it in there. And what the guest on the podcast says is, maybe the next level question is, it's not about, okay, sure, it matters to that starfish, but that's not really what maybe that's not what the person was asking. Like maybe they're asking other questions like, how did the starfish get here? Why are there so many? Is there something else that's going on that is causing all these starfish to be beached and die? Like, is there another thing we could do
That would help all the starfish.
right,
not that
can we get the root
starfish.
cause? And so the first time I listened to the podcast, I ended like with just like, I've never heard that before, and what a profound thought that it really does require us to ask other questions. And so just that quick fix that, we'll save a few and the rest, okay, we did what we could do. But maybe there's more we can do. Maybe there are underlying ways to fix things, to use a term that we all are close to, but it does require us to maybe like sit quietly for a few minutes and contemplate what those things might be.
I think that's interesting, and I think it's interesting in the context of this conversation that perhaps both of those people were walking down that beach considering the starfish and what to do about it. And in that moment, the two of them, though well-intentioned, maybe didn't have a common sense solution.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly it. All right, well, that brings us to the end for this week. Thank you, John Rourke, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Enjoy your tote bag. sir.
Thank you. I will. I'll tote many things in it.
Next week, we'll have a guest lined up. So I don't know who it is yet, but I will. You'll find out next week, just like we will. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to rate us on iTunes. Remember, you can connect with us on Twitter and Instagram at Let's Fix This OK. Scott is at SC Melson. I am at Andy OKC. You can also like our Facebook page for Let's Fix This. We are facebook.com/Let's Fix This OK. Our website, as you've probably figured out, is letsfixthisok.org. And you can sign up for our newsletter, read our blog, and details about upcoming events. By the way, if you're still listening, next Tuesday, we're going to have our second annual Let's Mail This event, where we get together and it's kind of a holiday party. And we also are going to take some time to write holiday cards to legislators and other elected officials. If you'd like to join us, all the details are on our Facebook page and our website. We'd love for you to come and get to say hi and maybe commune with you for a few minutes and, discuss how to fix things and to do a little community building rather than community fighting. Our podcast is edited and produced by Scott and me, and we are a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network, and our theme music is graciously provided by the Sugar Free All-Stars. Let's Fix This is a nonpartisan, non-profit organization, and we strive to educate and equip all Oklahomans to engage with the government. We encourage you to get involved in any way that you can, and remember, decisions are made by those who show up. Have a great week.